the last year, January the 6th attack on the Capitol, has laid out evidence today that former President Donald Trump was told that his plan to overturn the 2020 election was illegal, but nevertheless pressured Vice President Mike Pence to go along with it, ultimately turning a violent mob on him when he refused to comply. Let's listen to Representative Pete Aguilar his opening address to today in the January the 6th hearing.
Today, we intend to show the American people that January 6th was not an isolated incident. In the weeks culminating before, it was a legal scheme and deception. We've already learned that President Trump knew he lost the 2020 election. Shortly after, he began to look for a way to circumvent our country's most fundamental civic tradition, the peaceful transfer of power.
I'm joined now by Galen, who's the former strategist for George W. Bush, for Senator John McCain, for Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, and co-founder of the Lincoln Project, which at the last election campaigned for Joe Biden against Donald Trump, but from a Republican standpoint. Thank you very much for joining me, Reed. Tell us about what happened today in the Congressional Committee inquiry.
No, sure, and thanks for having me. I think the first thing is, if as far as television is concerned, I think this might have been the most sort of down in the weeds legal discussion, right, between the committee and the witnesses. But I think it will also be ultimately the most legally damaging.
He comes against
a guy named.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Carry on. No, sorry. The line stopped, and I thought you'd stop. So you finished. You're the one that we all want to hear.
So no, what I would say is that I think it was the most legally damaging for both Donald Trump and John Eastman, who seems to be the legal architect of so much of what we saw that culminated at January 6th.
He did seem to have issued a statement suggesting to Mike Pence that he carried on something a little bit illegal. I don't think that's the exact quote, but it's not too far off.
No, well, that's right. And I think the other part that was so concerning about Eastman and Trump was that they were totally willing to both incite and to accept violence, both against Mike Pence personally, against the United States Capitol, and against the system of American government specifically. In one of the interviews, one of Trump's lawyers said, if you take the votes away of 78 million Americans, there's going to be riots in the streets. And Eastman said, you know what, a little blood on the streets is sometimes good for democracy. Like, that is not good for democracy. That only works in an authoritarian regime.
How is the reputation of Mike Pence as a result of all this? In some ways, some people may say, actually, Mike Pence showed great integrity and he was very brave. The problem he's got is that the only people who might be willing to say that are people who are completely opposed to everything that he stands for. And the people who seem to be supportive of things that he stands for, including deciding to become vice president for Donald Trump, are not very impressed by the stance that he took. Does he have anybody who sort of says, you know what, I think this was a pretty stand-up guy?
Well, I will say this. In the fight on behalf of American democracy, you can disagree with Mike Pence for the 4 years he was Donald Trump's vice president. You can disagree with any number of things on how he feels about policy. But I will say this, and I would tell those people, when the time came, Mike Pence did what he needed to do. He did it in the face of Donald Trump. He did it to the face of Donald Trump. And he did it as he was within 40 feet of protesters who were ready, willing, and able to harm him, his staff, and his family personally. And when the time came and he is standing in a parking garage somewhere, hiding and for his life, and his Secret Service agents are saying, we're going to get out of here, we got to get out of here, he said no. They're not going to see the Vice President of the United States running away. We're going to stay here, we're going to finish our job, and we're going to do this the right way. And so if you want to complain about Mike Pence as vice president, I understand. But when the time came, he did the thing that American democracy needed him to do, and I think we should, at least in that narrow band, appreciate him for it.
Do any Republicans in what is now the mainstream of the Republican Party, which is not where you stand, do any of them see that? Or is he simply the subject of a fairly undiluted dislike from people who support President Trump?
I would say that I think the latter is correct, which is 2/3 of the Republican Party, as it is constituted today, probably sees him as a traitor to Donald Trump, to the cause, and to the country. And there's a third of Republicans who probably say, you know what, Mike Pence, as American conservatism goes, was a very conservative guy, and I appreciate what he did. Does that mean anybody will ever vote for him again? That I can't tell you, but I think that you're right. Most of the Republican Party sees him as an apostate, sees him as a traitor.
So it must be difficult for Republicans on his wing of the party now to find a place to stand. I noticed that in the election, those people who were even somewhat critical of Donald Trump in the most recent tranche of elections, because there are sort of constant votes going on in primaries and different things, that those people are finding it difficult to raise money, and they're finding it difficult to get elected. Is that wing of the party that's somewhere between you and Donald Trump, that's more in the kind of Mike Pence era, struggling quite badly?
Well, look, I'm an independent now, right? And even when I was a Republican, Mike Pence was too conservative for me. But what I would say is that you're right, which is, remember that there were 10 Republican members of the United States House of Representatives that voted to impeach Donald Trump after January 6th. We will be lucky if one of those people is in Congress in January of 2023. The movements like these will often root out the most moderate members, or those people who they believe are not true believers first. And I think that, Mike Pence has never been called a moderate in his life, but he probably is in that wing at this point. And so I think it is difficult to win if you are not going to be very, very conservative, very pro-Trump, and probably even to this moment, despite all the evidence that we've seen in the last, Donald Trump did in fact win the 2020 election. And I think a lot of Republican candidates who've stated that are going to get asked about it, and they're going to have to decide whether or not to moderate their position based on this or double down. And I bet most of them will double down.
How big is the strand of opinion in American politics represented by the Lincoln Project, the position of people who'd been at one point mainstream Republicans who'd worked for, admittedly identifiably reformist Republicans like Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was making liberal speeches on immigration, even at the time when George W. Bush was first being elected. At a time when even Karl Rove
passed the landmark environmental bill when he was governor, right?
Exactly. So, how big is that kind of the Schwarzenegger strand in the Republican Party at the that's the wrong question actually, because some of it isn't in the Republican Party, as you suggested. How big a strand is it in American politics?
Within the Republican Party, I would say it's probably pretty small. We'd like to think it was bigger, but we don't delude ourselves into that. Into American politics, I would say that we represent a fairly broad swath of people who consider themselves establishment or traditional Republicans, moderate independents, whether or not that's center right or center left, and I think a fair number of Democrats who are frustrated and very worried about the country. So I would say that we have a pretty broad reach when it comes to that. The vast majority of this country in the United States still lies somewhere in the middle of the two political poles in this country, whether or not that's the Democrats or the Republicans on their extremes. And I think that, look, we only do one thing, which is fight for democracy, and that's what we'll keep doing. And I think that there are a lot of Americans who, what we saw in 2019 when we started, which is somebody who's willing to stand up and fight for decency, the rule of law, and just like getting back to some semblance of normalcy, which it will take, admittedly, years to get back to.
Are you not taking yourself out of the game by making that decision? So I understand the desire to say I'm not collectively responsible for the Republican Party anymore. I'm going to be non-Republican, but by becoming independent, as opposed to making a decision, now, as I supported Joe Biden at the last presidential election, and I'm probably going to vote Democrat at the next election, I may as well take a role in choosing Democrat candidates.
Well, I would say this. One, I'm not a Democrat, as you mentioned. But secondly, our job and I think our role, it's a great question, because you're right. We are atypical in American politics, where people line up with one party or another and you're adjacent. We have staked out a firmly independent stance because, again, being pro-democracy or being anti-Trump are the only two things that we worry about. And we go for pro-democracy candidates. Look, I would support more Republicans if more of them stood up for the rule of law and the United States Constitution. Unfortunately, the party as a whole has become an anti-democratic institution run by anti-democratic people. And so when we fight, we fight to show voters in a given district or a given state or in the country writ large that you may never have voted for a Democrat before, and you may never vote for a Democrat again. But in this moment, what we're doing is asking you to cross over and cast a ballot for something bigger than party identification and bigger than the thing you've always done your whole life, which is the future of the country itself.
You can't see the Lincoln Project beginning to run its own nominated candidates.
We get asked that question a lot. I will not bore you or your listeners with it, but unlike, I believe, in the UK, it is very, very difficult to start new parties in the United States, mostly because both the Republican and the Democratic parties at the state level make it very, very difficult to do so. But so long as we can help defend, the American democratic system and political way of life, we'll do that. And if we feel like that mission's accomplished, we're happy to find a new adventure.
Well, you're talking to someone who tried the whole setting up a new party, including being a parliamentary candidate and on the national executive. And I can tell you it is pretty difficult here too. Reed Galen, co-founder of the Lincoln Project, former strategist for George W. Bush, that is, John McCain and Arnold Schwarzenegger. Thank you very much for joining me. It's Daniel Finkelstein here on Times Radio. And now at 11:30, it is Cara Bentley with the news.